Is China carried by Koreans? The narrative that the recent years of LPL domination only come off of the back of Korean players carrying the region, and the implication is that without those Korean players, China wouldn't have actually won anything over the last couple of years, is rather popular among some Western fans who have gotten used to the idea of Koreans being better than them over the entire history of the League of Legends professional scene, but simply won't admit that China is the current overlord, and also popular among some Korean fans who still believe that their region is the best, their players are the best, and therefore China could only beat them ever by importing their players, stealing their best players, if you will, and thus depleting the Korean resources of talent by simply gobbling them all up. Alright, let's dive into this topic and explore the idea a little bit. What actually supports this idea, this claim of those fans? If we look at some of the successful Chinese rosters of the history of our competition, we can see that yes, the 2015 MSI, the 2018 World Championship, and also the most recent World Championship of last year were all won by Chinese teams with 2 Korean imports, high-profile Korean imports in some cases, on their rosters. Alright, this is some sort of a compelling case. You could argue that China never has won anything without good Korean players on their rosters. Also, in the most recent LPL split, 18% of the starting players were Koreans, and therefore we can once again see that most LPL rosters still have 1 or 2 Korean players on their teams. There are teams in the LPL that don't use any Koreans, or any imports for that matter, but still 18% is somewhat of a substantial part of your league being imported from Korea. Now, I want to start disproving that claim by looking at the best Korean teams from the 2014 World Championship, which famously, in a move now titled the Korean Exodus, all 10 players of those teams moved to China. 9 of those had a starting position in China in the very next split. 1 of them played in the Chinese lower leagues. Now, all those players were high-profile Korean imports to China in 2015. Now, if China was really carried by Koreans, we would expect a rapid increase in Chinese competitiveness at international events after that event occurring. Those 10 players to China, and some more from the LCK even, OGN back in the time, but we're talking about the Korean scene, moving to China. What did it actually do for the Chinese team? Well, China went on to win the next MSI, or the first ever MSI to be accurate, so you could say that, well, there is your immediate result of success. But that MSI was only EDG winning against masochist Comas SKT, and frankly regarded by many experts as some sort of a fluke win, although no one would argue that EDG was actually a bad team. They certainly were competent, just not better than other elite teams around the globe. But if we all remember what happened next, at the World Championship, they got shitstomped by a Fnatic team with also 2 Korean players on their side. We won't disregard that, but they went out in the quarterfinals 3-0, didn't do much, didn't look like specifically an elite team at the tournament either. So China was actually way less competitive at 2015 Worlds, right after the Korean influx of huge talent and 5 world champions into their region, than they were in the 2 previous years. In 2013 and 14, China both years sent a representative to the World's Finals. 2015 went out in quarters, didn't do anything, didn't look impressive either. So where was the improvement? Where was the rapid increase in international performance? And also the years after that, we can look at some other numbers, but the Koreans didn't have an immediate impact on the Chinese scene. And those Koreans on this list here were just as talented, if not better players than the Koreans that are going to China in the recent years nowadays, compared to the field, obviously. Now we can take a look at another league that likes to import high-profile Koreans, obviously not to the same extent as the LPL, North America's LCS. In 2016, those 5 players all played in the LCS. Impact, Rush, Huni, Reignover, and Piglet. All high-profile Korean players to some extent. Impact and Piglet won Worlds only 3 years prior to that. Still great players for the NALCS region, but also internationally very, very respectable players. Reignover and Huni had just gone to the World semifinals. Also very good players compared to the rest of the world even. And Rush was a great jungler for the LCS. We sadly never got to see him in his prime compete against LCK teams, but I'm sure he wasn't too far behind the curve either at this point in time. Then in 2018 LCS, look at that pool of top laners. Impact, Flame, Sunday and Huni. Those 4 players in 2018 could have all played still on Korean top teams and looked decent. Lyra, Arrow and Olay were all good Korean players that could hang with the best in their roles. Internationally, Lyra maybe not so much anymore, but before people start to meme on him, he was the MVP. Around that time, he was a great performing player and only started to dip in performance in 2018, which obviously prior to his signing could not have been known. So my argument is that also North America started importing good Korean players, and the LCS didn't perform either internationally. None of these Korean players went on to do especially great things in North America. Obviously, Impact was some of the better Cloud9 runs at Worlds, but that's it. The competitiveness of the region wasn't raised. They were never in any serious conversation for being a favorite of Worlds or even a dark horse to make a run for the title. So we can see that a similar influx of talent on a obviously much smaller scale occurred in the LCS as it did in the LPL, but still the region didn't come nowhere close to any meaningful international result around that time. Now we can compare those numbers from earlier, where I said that in the recent LPL split, 18% of the players that were starters were Korean, and that's 44% of the available import slots being Korean. In the 2015 spring season, which is right after the Korean exodus, 30% of the players were Korean starters, which is 3/4 of the available import slots being used for Korean players. That is obviously almost twice the percentage amount of Koreans that we have nowadays in the league. So, and again, those Koreans were just as talented compared to the field as the ones today are in the LPL. Elite players going over to China and almost twice the number. So if the Chinese players back then and today were really just below the Korean players, the league obviously would have been way better back then compared to nowadays, where there's only 18% of Korean starters. But those 30% of Korean starters didn't manage to carry the league and didn't do any great things at the World Championships in the years of 2015, 16, 17. Those were all years where we had straight up Korean finals. All 3 of these years at Worlds, no Chinese team made it to the finals, and frankly, no Chinese team even came really close. You could argue in 2017 Royal came somewhat close, and obviously they did, as they went on to have a 5-game series against SKT to get to the finals, but they weren't a great team either. And yeah, my point still stands. Where is the improvement in performance from injecting those Koreans? The glory days of China prior to the recent World Championship victories were Season 3 and Season 4, where there were way less Korean players in their league. Barely any at all, to be fair. Lastly, let's look at the recent World Championships of last year, where FPX won the championship rather easily. And we can take a look at their roster with 2 Korean players on them. And here's another, well, contradiction I want to point out in many narratives. So many people, especially from the West, were shit-talking Doinb the entire tournament, saying how he wasn't a good mid laner, as in laning prowess, and Gimgun as he simply performed rather bad at the tournament, especially in early stages, where he was supposed to be that unbreakable impact type weak side top laner, but instead got shit on by people such as Wizzy Chachi on his Cho'Gath, famously, and people made out made those two Koreans out to be the weakest links of their team at times. Of course, still the consensus is that ONB elevated the team by bringing his style and only enabling the team through that style to win the World Championship. But people really have to make up their mind on this thing. Was it that the Koreans carried the LPL to another World Championship, or were Doinbi and Gimgun shit? You can't have it both ways. If those two players truly were shit and they didn't match up to the other players in the tournament, many people calling Doinbi the worst mid laner in the knockout stage of the tournament, famously after the Nemesis controversy. Which way is it then? Are they carried by Koreans, or are Doinbi and Gimgun shit? So lastly, let's draw a conclusion from all of what has been said. We can obviously tell that there are substantial amounts of Korean players in the LPL and always have been ever since the Korean exodus. So if the question, are they carried by Koreans, is are there Korean players on every successful LPL squad? That is the case. But there are also Korean players of comparable talent on NA teams or other teams such as Europe in the past, and we don't see the same amount of success. We also had a way higher amount of Koreans in the past in the Chinese league, and they didn't amount to anything. Their teams didn't make anything happen at Worlds. So what does that tell us? There have always been good Koreans in the Chinese league, on the Chinese teams, and carrying them at times. But even if those players were the best players on their teams for most part of their careers, the league only became competitive and, in fact, the best league internationally after they had a system in place where they were able to foster enough regional talent to make those Korean imports work, which is the exact problem the LCS in North America is having right now, where they have good imports and those imports are the best players on their team, but they have no regional talent to support them. And frankly, those LPL players nowadays, they are just as good as the Korean players on their teams. And only through that, only through a vital, huge regional scene where China has by far the biggest player base, everybody knows that. Only after that was established did China actually emerge and become the new overlord, which is supported by the Korean players. And certainly at times, Korean players have been the standout performers on those rosters, but the league would be nowhere near where they are right now and look much more like NA if they didn't invest into their scene and have Chinese players step up just as much as the Korean imports. And this also applies to Europe in some extent, by the way. People like Veteran have pushed for this narrative for a long time that EU could have overtaken Korea or been competitive with Korea at World Championships way earlier, according to Veteran, if they had properly invested into their own talent, which there was plenty of, and not relied on imports for such a long time, importing Korean players way beyond season 5, season 6 even, and therefore hindering their own development of talent, which is vital and essential if you want to have a chance at any World Championship. So there is no surprise that the first European teams who went to the World Finals in Fnatic and also in G2 used 0 imports and 0 Korean players on the teams, but only players that came up from the European servers. So a parallel can clearly be seen between EU's rise to success and China's rise to success, only occurring after their own regional scenes have been established properly and now finally are able to foster good endemic talent.